There are tragedies that grip a nation, names that become headlines, families that become symbols of grief. And then there are the stories that follow, the ones too complicated, too bitter, too human for the evening news. This one began after the funerals, after the public outcry, after the cameras were packed away. It began with a document, 8.5 by 11 inches, printed with legal precision. A life insurance policy worth $450,000. It wasn't a murder trial. It wasn't about who did it. Everyone already knew that. There were no questions of guilt. No jury deliberations. Just two families, one grieving the daughter they lost, the other left with the shame of a son they could no longer defend, both walking into a courtroom for something else entirely. One family claimed the policy belonged to them. They had suffered the unthinkable. They had been robbed of their child and grandchildren. They had sat through a courtroom, listened to the horror, and still found the strength to stand. The other family said they, too, had lost. They didn't ask for this. They didn't choose the path their son took. But they insisted that grief doesn't come with conditions. And when it came to the money, they said they had rights. No cameras. No reporters. Just legal filings. Quiet hearings. And beneath it all, a question that no court could ever truly answer: what is justice when there's nothing left to save? This is the story the headlines skipped. The one that never made it to primetime. The war over money tied to death. And the families forced to relive their pain just to claim what they believed was already theirs. You're about to hear every document, every deal, every tear, every silence that spoke louder than words. This is the insurance war you've never heard about. And by the end, you'll understand why some stories never find peace, even after the verdicts have been read. Frederick, Colorado. A quiet town framed by wide skies and still neighborhoods. Nothing here would suggest the weight it carries. Nothing here speaks of what once unfolded behind one particular front door. The house sits back from the street, motionless. Shutters closed. A mailbox unused. A place that once held laughter, birthdays, bedtime stories, now holds memories no one wants. It was inside that home where the lives of Shanann and her two daughters ended. But that part you already know. What you don't know is what happened afterward. Let's begin with the people left standing. Cindy and Ronnie Watts. The parents of the man who confessed to killing his pregnant wife and their two little girls. A couple who now carried a name most couldn't say without a shudder. They hadn't asked for the headlines. They didn't ask to be defined by the worst thing their son ever did. And yet, that's exactly what happened. On the other side, Frank and Sandra Rzusek. Parents who buried their daughter, their grandchildren, and the future they thought they had. They had sat through every painful second of courtroom proceedings. They had heard things no parent should ever have to hear. And when the cameras turned off and the reporters left town, they were still standing there, grieving in a way the world could never fully understand. Both families had lost. But the losses were different. And soon, they'd find themselves standing on opposite sides of another battle. Before the murders, Chris Watts worked for Anadarko Petroleum. As part of his employment, he had a group life and accidental death policy. It was standard, $500,000 in case of an accident. Most never think twice about these things. A form you sign once. A deduction from your paycheck. But when death comes suddenly, and violently, that policy becomes more than paperwork. It becomes something else entirely. According to the documents, Shanann was designated to receive 60% of that payout. The girls, 15% each. Together, $450,000. But they were gone now. And the one person legally tied to the benefit, Chris, was disqualified. Colorado's Slayer statute made sure of that. You cannot profit from a crime you commit. Especially not one like this. Chris Watts, by law, was entitled to nothing. And so, the money had nowhere to go. It hung in the balance. A six-figure sum that no longer had a rightful owner. That's when the filings began. Frank and Sandra Rzusek believed the payout belonged to their daughter's estate. They had suffered the greatest loss. They had carried her casket. They had cradled their grandchildren one last time. There was no question, in their minds, about who the money should go to. But then came the claim from Ronnie and Cindy Watts. They, too, believed they were entitled to something. Their argument was clear: Shanann and the girls were family. Their grandchildren. Their daughter-in-law. They had once shared Christmases, phone calls, photographs. That meant something. And in their eyes, even with the horror their son had caused, they hadn't forfeited the right to grieve, or to claim a share of what remained. Suddenly, what had seemed like a tragic but settled matter became something else. Two families. Both with legal counsel. Both claiming the same sum. Zurich American Insurance Company, faced with conflicting claims, made a rare move. They refused to pay their side directly. Instead, they deposited the full $450,000 into the court's registry. A holding account untouched, until a judge could decide who, if anyone, deserved to receive it. The war was no longer emotional. It was legal. In quiet rooms, across formal tables, it began. The insurance war had officially started. In law offices miles apart, the silence was broken by the clicking of keyboards, the turning of pages, the low tones of attorneys explaining options no family should ever have to hear. The paperwork was thick. The arguments complex. But the tension? That needed no explanation. Zurich American Insurance Company had made their move. The money was no longer just a check. It was now evidence. Now leverage. Held in a court account, frozen, until a judge could decide who had the right to claim it. The legal filings began to take shape. Motions. Statements of claim. Declarations under oath. On one side, there was Essex. On the other, the Watts family. And sitting above it all, a rule both sides had to contend with: Colorado's Slayer statute. The statute is blunt. If you are responsible for someone's death, you cannot benefit from it. No inheritance. No property. No insurance money. In Chris Watts' case, that meant the life insurance policy tied to his employment at Anadarko was out of reach. But the statute said nothing about his family. That gray area became the battleground. The Watts family argued they had suffered a loss, too. They hadn't committed a crime. They hadn't planned a murder. They had once held those girls in their arms. They had once welcomed Shanann into their home. That counted for something. Cindy Watts, during a court proceeding, spoke with a voice that trembled not just from pain, but from exhaustion. She said they had lost everything, just like there was a sex. She asked how grief could be measured, how suffering could be divided. She questioned why the sins of her son had to strip them of any recognition at all. But for Frank and Sandra Ruzasek, the mere suggestion that the Watts family might receive any portion of that money felt like a knife twisting deeper. Sandra's voice cracked during a recorded statement, her breath catching in her throat as she tried to say the words. She didn't understand how this could even be up for discussion. She had buried her daughter. She had buried her grandbabies. She'd watched the courtroom video. She had read the autopsy reports. She knew what Chris had done. And to her, the idea that his family might walk away with money meant for Shanann and the girls wasn't just wrong. It was a betrayal. Letters were exchanged between attorneys. Depositions were taken. Statements were filed. Flashed to the court documents, black ink on white paper, words like entitlement, beneficiary, compensable interest. None of it touched the pain underneath. Clips from local reporters began surfacing. Social media lit up. Comment sections flooded with outrage. Strangers took sides. Some said the Watts family had no right to anything, not a dollar, not a moment of sympathy. Others said it wasn't so simple. That parents shouldn't be punished for what their children did. Still, the Ruzaseks held firm. The money, they argued, should go to Shanann's estate. If Shanann were alive, it would have gone to her. If the girls were alive, it would have been theirs. But they weren't. And the reason for that wasn't an accident. It wasn't fate. It was murder. They reminded the court that Shanann's name was on the policy. Not Cindy's. Not Ronnie's. Shanann. The Watts family pushed back, arguing that legal technicalities didn't erase emotional ties. That grief doesn't have to be exclusive. That mourning isn't a competition. But as each side laid their claim, the courtroom grew colder. This wasn't a trial for a killer. It was a trial for what was left behind. $4 tied to the dead. And underneath the legal language, a single, haunting question began to take shape. Should the family of a murderer be allowed to receive anything connected to the lives he took? There was no clear answer. But the court would soon be asked to find one. It didn't take long for the lawsuit to catch public attention. Word spread, first in whispers, then in headlines. The families were back in court, but this time it wasn't about criminal justice. It was about money. Zurich American Insurance had done what many corporations do when the situation gets too complicated, too charged. They stepped back. The company deposited the full $450,000 into the custody of the court, stripping themselves of responsibility. Let the families fight. Let the judge decide. The news hit the Sussex like a second wave. To them, the act of filing that insurance claim should have been a formality. But instead, it reopened wounds. Frank Sussex appeared in an interview, eyes heavy, voice shaking. "We lost everything. And they wanted money?" That sentence would be repeated across news stories, podcasts, message boards. For many, it captured the heartbreak and disbelief of the entire ordeal. The mediation began. Meetings behind closed doors. Attorneys reading from binders thick with policy language and prior case law. No cameras. No audio. Just silence. Then arguments. Then silence again. But there was no agreement. The Watts family held their position. They insisted they bore no legal or moral guilt. They didn't commit the murders. They didn't stand behind Chris. They were parents who had suffered too, differently yes, but still suffered. Ronnie Watts told his attorney in a quiet statement submitted to court. "We never asked for this. We never thought we'd be here. But we loved those girls. We never stopped." Still, the mediation failed. The judge gave the families time to consider a settlement. Weeks passed. And then, a decision was made. A settlement agreement was quietly filed. No press conference. No cameras. Just black ink, court seals, and signatures. The Sussex would receive $375,000. The Watts family, $75,000. The courtroom records showed no celebration, no closure. Only division. That moment became the turning point. The checks would be written. The court had ruled. But the fracture between the families was now permanent. Depositions tell the story best. Sandra's words echo from the pages. This wasn't about the money. It was about respect. About right and wrong. About Shanann. Cindy's words, more subdued, but etched with quiet sadness. "We didn't come for a fight. We just didn't want to be erased." No one won. Everyone left the courtroom with less than they brought in. But for the Sussex, it wasn't over yet. They filed a separate civil suit against Chris Watts. This time, they weren't just seeking recognition. They were demanding accountability. In dollars. The court ruled in their favor. $6 million in damages. And they placed that number as a lien against the house, the very place their daughter and grandchildren had died. The house in Frederick, Colorado became a ghost. Legally tangled, emotionally untouchable. No one bought it. No one dared. It went into foreclosure, but never really left the market. It still sits there today, quiet, locked, untouched. A symbol. A scar. The aftermath extended beyond courtrooms. Sandra Sussex withdrew from public life. Diagnosed with PTSD, she struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, and the weight of public scrutiny. Cindy Watts disappeared as well, fewer appearances, no interviews, no news statements. The strain of defending a name the world had already condemned proved too heavy. But online, the war raged on. Comment sections became battlegrounds. Threads of support. Threads of hate. Speculation. Judgment. sympathy, cruelty. Some blamed the Watts family for asking for money at all. Others called the settlement fair. The internet became the courtroom that never closed. And the jury, faceless and infinite, still hasn't reached a verdict. Because in the end, this wasn't just about legal filings or insurance checks. It was about two families, each torn apart in different ways, trying to make sense of something senseless. And what they found wasn't justice. It was paperwork. It was grief. It was the kind of silence that never really ends. What would you do if the family of your daughter's killer demanded part of her life insurance? Would you take them to court? Would you sit across from them in a legal mediation room? Would you settle? Would you ever find peace? These aren't just questions for the Sussex or the Watts family. These are questions for all of us. Was the settlement fair? Or should the Watts family have received nothing at all? We want to know what you think. Tell us in the comments below. Every perspective matters. We read every word. If this story moved you, if you believe more people need to understand what happens long after the headlines disappear, then like this video, share it, and subscribe for more stories that go beyond the surface. Because there's more to this story. More than court transcripts. More than settlements. There are things even the judges never saw. Stay tuned.